So we're going to finish talking about blood. Then we're going to talk about what happens to the cardiovascular stuff during exercise. And then we'll see if we have a little bit of time to answer a couple of questions, which you guys seem very disinclined to want to do. I'm a little bit fussy today, so I apologize about all of that, but we need a little bit more energy out of all of this, or I may be a little upset, which is okay. So I had a long weekend driving back and forth to Arkansas, and I played golf yesterday for the first time in like a year, and I can barely move. My back is doing really not great, and I've taken a lot of drugs this morning, so we'll see how this goes. Okay. All right, so we're going to talk about blood. Okay. Now I think I mentioned the other day, blood is a very underappreciated to me part of the cardiovascular system. Okay. We're going to look at sort of the red blood cells that are going to be in the blood, which is what most people think of, okay? But from an exercise perspective, the water or the plasma in your blood is also really, really, really important from a dissipating heat standpoint and maintaining blood volume standpoint, which helps us maintain stroke volume and cardiac output. So we'll talk a little bit about what that's gonna do, what that's gonna look like, okay? But the things that blood does, in addition to just carrying oxygen and CO2 and hormones and glucose and free fatty acids, so all of these things that we need in tissues for exercise, it helps us to regulate temperature. And then we'll do this more next week when we talk about kind of what happens in the pulmonary system, but it actually happens in the blood, is that we use things in the blood to help us buffer and balance pH. Okay. When you make lactic acid, we're going to buffer that and deal with that in the blood. Okay, up to a point. I think I mentioned, you guys, that I used to have 2-liter bottles, and then in one of the moves they got busted open, but I had 2-liter bottles filled with water with red food coloring in it. Okay. And so I would bring them in, I would set them down and be like, here's how much blood is in your body. Okay. Typically for you guys, y'all have somewhere between about 4 and 6 liters of blood in your body, which is actually not that much when you think and you kind of see it sitting there right in front of you. Okay. It's very much related to body size and your state of aerobic training. People that are larger tend to have more blood. People that are highly trained will have more than an untrained person of a similar body size. It's one of the things that helps us the most in the cardiovascular sense when we respond to training, as we expand our blood volume. Okay. So in general, men are about 5 to 6, women are about 4 to 5, give or take kind of the effects of body size and training. Okay. No. Maybe it's going to go. So blood is made up of primarily water and red cells. We call red cells erythrocytes. We call the water in the blood, or it's mostly water, we call that plasma. Okay, plasma. So we will talk about plasma volume, the amount of water or water plus some proteins and a couple of other things that's in your blood. Okay, so you collect a vial of blood, you put it in a centrifuge, and you spin it. All the red cells go down to the bottom. Okay, and then we have plasma there at the top. In an average person who lives at sea level or close to sea level, like we do here in Oklahoma, and depending upon how well trained you are, your red cells are going to make up somewhere between about 40 and 45% of your blood. Okay, which means then that 55 to 60% of your blood is water. Okay, it's this plasma. When you go to altitude, plasma falls, red cells go up over time. Okay, one of the first things that happens when you go to altitude is you pee more. And so your plasma volume falls, your red cell content stays the same. And so you actually have a higher percentage of red cells in your blood. Okay. Now, we call collectively, it's 99% red cells, and then the other 1% is white cells and platelets. We call that hematocrit. Okay. So when you're talking about red cell content in blood, you would say your hematocrit percentage is 40% or 45%. Okay. We can, by going to altitude and doing a couple of other things, we could manipulate your red cell content up to the high 40s, maybe to right about 50 or 51% without taking artificial erythropoietin, okay, without doing the blood doping, okay? The other way to make your red cell count go up is give a pint of blood, wait 3 or 4 months, let all your red cell count come back, and then spin down your blood, take all the red cells and inject them back in. Also very commonly done by endurance athletes. Okay. Anything over 52, 53% from a hematocrit percentage, and you are what we would call a blood donor. Okay. If you want to make your endurance capacity increase, the easiest and fastest thing to do is to give yourself more red blood cells. You'll carry more oxygen. It expands your blood volume, so it makes your stroke volume and cardiac output go up. But the big deal is you can carry more oxygen. Okay, immediate effects. If I give every one of you an extra pint of red cells. Okay, the problem is your blood becomes really thick and sludgy, and you fall asleep at night, and your heart rate falls, and you develop blood clots. Okay, and you develop blood clots, so it can be really dangerous to do those kinds of things. But that's what's going on here. Okay, and so the reason that that's so powerful from an exercise perspective is because of what is on red blood cells and kind of what their function is. Okay. So I should mention that red cells are always in a state of turnover. Okay. You're always making new ones. You're always destroying what's there. They have a turnover time of somewhere between about 90 and 120 days. Okay. But their primary function is carry oxygen. Okay. In order to carry oxygen, red cells contain something called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin has iron in it. Okay. If anybody remembers your chemistry, iron is very powerfully positively charged. And so it is very attracted to oxygen. It wants to grab that oxygen, and it does so very efficiently. You bind 4 oxygen to every molecule of hemoglobin, and every red blood cell has hundreds of millions of hemoglobins on it. So you can bind millions, hundreds of millions of oxygen molecules onto a single red blood cell. It's very efficient. So if you make yourself have more, then you can increase what we would call your oxygen carrying capacity. There's more oxygen in your body. Therefore, there's more that can potentially go into your muscles and be used at the end of the electron transport. Okay, this we're very good at. Anybody ever put those little pulse ox, little things on your finger? Go to the doctor and they check you out and do those kinds of things. Okay, as long as you have good pulmonary function, unless you've got some sort of disorder with your red cells, most people are going to be, even when you're doing high intensity exercise, somewhere north of 95% saturation on those red blood cells, because we're so efficient at binding oxygen because of those hemoglobin molecules. Okay, you guys are generally at rest going to be 98, 99% saturated. Okay, because of that, it's rare, okay, that an inability to bind oxygen to hemoglobin is rare to be a thing that limits exercise. Okay, that's rarely going to be a problem. Most people that have a problem getting oxygen on the hemoglobin, it's not the problem of the blood, it's a pulmonary issue, it's a lung issue. Okay, and we'll get a little bit into that next week when we talk about pulmonary function, but we're very good at this. Okay. You guys have seen something probably in human phys called the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curves.
Yes.
Do you guys remember those? They kind of look like an S. Okay. I'm not going to make you guys know that curve. But the general sense is the way the curve is set up is that it's very easy if O2 saturation on hemoglobin falls even a little bit. It's very, very, very easy for us to bind more on in the lungs. Okay. And then it's going to take a fairly low oxygen content in a muscle, which is what we get during exercise, to drive hemoglobin off, or drive oxygen off of the hemoglobin and into our tissue. But a cool thing happens during exercise. Okay. The relationship and things of how we bind and unbind on hemoglobin shifts. And the curve shifts to the right because of an increase in temperature, because of a slight change in pH, and it makes it easier to put hemoglobin, to put oxygen on the hemoglobin and also to get it off. So we actually become even better at this during exercise. Okay. We're not going to get into all the hows and whys on the curve and everything else. You don't have to draw the curve. I just want you to be aware that we're really good at binding oxygen, and exercise actually makes us even better. The conditions that surround exercise make us better. Okay. All right. Now the moment of truth. Okay. What happens to all of your cardiovascular variables during exercise? Here is where I need you all to sort of be good participating students, or we will all get up and do jumping jacks and force all of these things. Okay. So when you exercise, the primary thing that happens is cardiac output goes up. Okay. Cardiac output goes up. It's very linear. As oxygen consumption increases, so does cardiac output. Okay. This should make a lot of sense. If I'm using more oxygen in my muscles, metabolism goes up. I have to supply oxygen to those muscles. And I will do that by raising heart rate, raising stroke volume, bringing more blood that has high oxygen in it to those muscles. Okay. So you can imagine then if cardiac output goes up, heart rate goes up. Stroke volume also goes up to a point. Okay. We'll get into the how and why of that in just a second. Other things that happen that we've talked about, right? We increase blood flow to the skin. Why is that important?
Give us more.
Cool us down. You're thinking right, friend. It's about temperature, okay? We need to send blood flow to the skin to help dissipate that extra heat that we're making from increased metabolism. We decrease blood flow to the kidneys and the spleen and your stomach and your intestines. Why? I need it to go to my muscles, yes. But why? Why don't we need it? Our kidneys and our stomach and our spleen.
Are you trying to save the plasma for sweat?
I'm trying to save it, yes. Okay. Right. Evolutionarily, who cares if you need to filter your blood to be able to pee if you're about to get eaten by a tiger or something, right? Or you got to fight somebody. But I'm serious. Like, this is during a bout of exercise, the last thing that we need to care about is, right, what's going on at the kidneys and the spleen. We're not worried about, am I going to send this up to the spleen and inject more white blood cells to fight off an infection, right? It's part of fight or flight. We maintain or we have a small increase in blood flow to the brain, okay? And then we have an increase in flow through the coronary arteries. You guys remember where the coronary arteries go? From the heart to the heart. Very good, okay? So work of the heart goes up during exercise. As it goes up, the heart also needs more blood flow, okay? The heart also needs more blood flow. To make use of that, 60% of cytoplasmic volume that is mitochondria, let's send a bunch of stuff there, okay? What we're trying to do with all of this, guys, is we have to find a balance between maintaining adequate blood pressure to keep cardiac output up and provide an adequate flow to the muscles and the heart and the brain. Okay, so all of our changes are going to take place in order to try to make all of that happen or keep that level of homeostasis happen. And y'all will see that we do that by raising systolic pressure and then by vasoconstricting blood vessels that go to the kidney and the liver and the stomach and the spleen and those splenic regions, vasodilating some to the skin and then vasodilating a huge amount going to skeletal muscle. Okay, and we counteract that vasodilation, which wants to drop blood pressure, by increasing cardiac contraction force and some things to be able to try to keep blood pressure up. So there's a sufficient amount of driving pressure at the aorta to get blood to move where we want it to go. Okay, so this is this big balancing act. Okay, all right. So here is the graph, basically what happens to cardiac output. Okay, we have treadmill speed on the x-axis on the bottom. We have cardiac output in liters per minute here on the y-axis. You could substitute treadmill speed for energy use or VO2, right? Aerobic metabolism. So as speed increases, energy use increases, aerobic metabolism increases, and there's this relatively linear increase in cardiac output. Okay? I think I mentioned the other day, of all the variables that we could measure as a surrogate for VO2 or energy use during exercise, cardiac output is the one that is the most closely related to it. Okay, the most closely related. Whichever of you in class has the largest cardiac output per your body size will have the highest VO2 max normalized to your body level. Okay, and so that's going to be a really, really important thing. Now you may say, well, Dr. Black, how the hell do we measure cardiac output if this is such an important thing, right? We don't ever measure this. Your watch doesn't tell you cardiac output. The best way to measure cardiac output is to run an aortic catheter, basically. They call these a central line if anybody has ever been to the hospital, okay? They essentially run a catheter into your aorta, not at all dangerous, right? And they put a little sensor there and they measure how much blood is moving past or through your aorta in a given minute. Okay, it's not very functional. Y'all want to go out for a run with like a central line.
I was about to say, is that even really safe?
It's not. No, I mean it's perfectly safe if a trained person does it. And sometimes what they'll do is they want to run those. They'll actually go in here.
Yeah.
They'll like go in like down. I mean, the femoral artery catheter is also not like the safest thing in the world either. But I mean, you know, they miss that and they get it wrong, you're going to bleed a bunch. But they'll run it there and then they snake it all the way up and they sit it there. Another way, it's slightly less accurate, is we can have you while you're running. Biking's a lot easier. We put an ultrasound on and we actually image. We do an echocardiogram of blood leaving the aorta during exercise. Kind of hard. It's easier when somebody's sitting doing recumbent biking because they're not moving around quite so much. We can do it that way. Okay. So this is the best thing. Okay. But the two things that contribute to cardiac output that make it go up are heart rate and stroke volume. Okay. Our heart rate and stroke volume. And so when I show you guys what happens to stroke volume and heart rate during exercise, the heart rate graph looks just like the cardiac output graph. It's very, very linear. As treadmill speed goes up, biking power output goes up, oxygen consumption goes up. Very linear with heart rate. Okay, very, very linear. Stroke volume is weird, but strangely more important. Okay, because stroke volume goes up, and then you get to kind of a brisk jog, and stroke volume flattens out. Okay, stroke volume flattens out. So let me show you those graphs. Here's heart rate. Okay, treadmill speed up, Heart rate up, very, very linear. It's not quite as predictive as cardiac output, right? Because you guys all are about the same age. You all have roughly the same age predicted max heart rate. So we can get an estimate of where you are, right? But it doesn't tell us a lot about what your VO2 actually is, right? We know your relative intensity. So heart rate's very linear. That's why your watches and the monitors and things measure heart rate. Okay. We're going to come back to this in a minute, but let me show you what stroke volume looks like, and then we'll come back and talk about why all of those things are doing what they're doing. Here's stroke volume. Okay. Stroke volume goes up and then it levels off. Okay. Up and levels off. The exercise intensity at which it levels off is going to vary from person to person, but the amount of stroke volume, that value actually is when it plateaus, is wildly important. Okay, wildly important. And we'll talk about why in just a second. Okay, so let me back up then. Here's cardiac output, relatively linear. Okay, if you imagine that somewhere right about here, about 10 or 11 kilometers per hour on our graph, somewhere in the middle here, stroke volume levels off and stops. How am I increasing cardiac output then above that point? What's the only thing that can change? Heart rate. Good. Okay. All right, let's do this. Everybody that is 21, stand up. Don't worry, we're not going to do anything embarrassing. We're not going to do anything other than, all right, look around at each other. People that aren't standing, y'all can look around at each other too. Okay? Every one of you that is standing has an age predicted max heart rate of what? 199. Okay. So if we accept, and we should, that max cardiac output, the highest cardiac output, has the highest VO2 max. Every one of you can get your heart rate to exactly the same place. Look around at each other and try to guess who's going to have the highest stroke volume and therefore the highest VO2 max. Anybody want to guess? You don't have to like actually point someone out and be like, that one. Let's not do that, okay? But if I want to predict between all of you who's the most fit and you're all the same age, the reason that stroke volume is the single most important cardiovascular predictor of aerobic fitness is because all of y'all can get your heart rate to the same place. So that's out the window. It's fine. It's the same. There's no difference. Okay? I have to figure out who has the biggest stroke volume. So if we had to guess, what are we looking at? Y'all can sit down. Okay. Who's going to have the biggest stroke volume? Yes. But are they okay? Yes, you're right, Bernie. But like, how do we guess?
We know that the VO2 can increase with less body fat.
Okay. Ooh, you're 100% right. But that's sort of outside of, if we thought that people had the same stroke volume and the same max heart rate, and they had less body fat, that's absolutely how we would do that. So that's another thing. How do we guess who's got the biggest? What anatomical thing would you want information on? Yes. Who has the biggest left ventricle? Who has the biggest heart? Okay. Not all. Right. Not who is the kindest or the most empathetic. This is literally who has the largest left ventricle. Okay? Because if I have a larger left ventricle, what can I put more in? Blood. I can have a larger end diastolic volume. And we should probably take heart size relative to body size, right? As well. And then we got to take overall body size. That is why. Okay? Stroke volume in people that are the same age or roughly the same age, which could be all of you guys. We're not that good at give or take 1 or 2 or 4 or 5 beats per minute of heart rate. Stroke volume is the best predictor in a group of people that are the same age, the best cardiovascular predictor of VO2 max. Okay? Whoever has the largest stroke volume when it plateaus wins. Okay? So now we have to figure out why does it plateau and how are we going to get a larger stroke volume? Okay? How are we going to get a larger stroke volume? Okay. We know that heart rate goes up because we remove vagal tone and we increase sympathetic inflow. Stroke volume goes up and therefore it will plateau, okay? Because we initially increase preload. We initially increase venous return from the muscle pump, okay? So there's more blood coming back. That will drive an increase in contractility, okay? That makes stroke volume go up. We get a further increase in contractility, not from preload, not from Frank Starling, but because of epinephrine and norepinephrine, especially norepinephrine. It makes the left ventricle contract more forcefully. So at the same preload, the heart contracts more forcefully, so more blood leaves. Stroke volume goes up. Okay. We also get what we call a decrease in peripheral resistance. As we vasodilate out to our skeletal muscles, it becomes easier for the blood to leave and flow to there, so more will go out. Okay. The problem is, at some point, the left ventricle is only so big. It can only hold and stretch so much. It can only respond, again, because it's only so big, it can only respond to norepinephrine to a certain extent. Okay? We can only decrease resistance to flow so much. And so at some point, all of those things tend to get maxed out. In most people, it's somewhere between about 50 and 60% of VO2 max. So it's kind of right in that kind of, I'm jogging to a brisk jog level of exercise. Okay? Which seems wild that something that stops at that point is the thing that predicts something that's going to be at a way higher intensity, but that's the truth. Okay. Now, there are other things that go into predicting VO2 max, red cell count, total blood volume, other things that are there. But of our cardiovascular variables, stroke volume is the most important. Okay. All right. Is this going to let me go on? Okay. Let me back up. I feel like I showed this earlier, but we'll go over it. I find this really fascinating, guys. What you see is kind of a cartoon depiction of resting heart rate and then heart rate at 180 beats per minute. In the red is systole. So it's the amount of time the left ventricle spends contracting, and then white is the amount of time or kind of relative that it spends during diastole or filling. So at a resting rate of about 75 beats per minute, we're at about 0.3 or a little over a third of a second in systole, and then a little over, at about half a second in diastole. But what happens as heart rate goes up is the overall amount of time in a cardiac cycle period shrinks. Okay? It shrinks from about 0.8 seconds down to about a third of a second. And the amount of time spent in systole and diastole both shrink, but diastole shrinks more. Okay? And so one of the things that happens at very, very high heart rates is diastole can become so short there's so little time to fill the left ventricle that we lose in diastolic volume. And so especially weirdly in very trained people at very, very high heart rates, we see stroke volume goes up and it levels off, and then as you get near your max heart rate, it may actually begin to sort of fall off a little bit and be a thing that predicts sort of the attainment of VO2 max. Because it's so short that you just can't fill it up as much as you would like to in order to maintain that maximal stroke volume. Okay, so just something else to kind of keep in mind. Okay. All right, so we did this. We talked about why does it plateau, right? We talked about increasing preload. We talked about contractility. We talked about this, but realistically, it plateaus because contractility maxes out because you can only preload so much. It can only respond to epi and norepi so much, and then that decrease in filling time. All right, so really a fascinating kind of thing. We can measure stroke volume without having to run a central line. If we can measure blood flow and we can measure blood pressure, we can actually estimate cardiac output from flow and pressure, which I've not shown you guys those equations. And if we know cardiac output and we know heart rate, then we can sort of backwards calculate stroke volume as well. Right, so if you guys ever go into an experiment in Dr. Kellerwan's lab, they will estimate stroke volume at times and cardiac output at times by measuring blood pressure, heart rate, and blood flow. We can kind of back out those sorts of things. Okay. You can also measure it by doing something called CO2 rebreathing, where you breathe back in the air you've just breathed out in a big balloon, which is not a very pleasant sort of thing to try to do, but these are going to be really important variables. Okay. All right. So I know that we showed one cartoon about blood distribution and where it's going. We talked about that stuff last week. I actually like this graph in some ways even more than the one showing like the brain is big or the brain is small or the muscles are getting a bunch or they're not. What you see here in the left panel is the relative contribution, okay? Relative to sort of each other, where is blood flow going? Okay. So now you have to imagine, as you see in the right panel, that overall cardiac output increases as you go from rest to walking to jogging to maximal exercise. But the left panel is just of the cardiac output that we have, where is it all going? And the very clear change, right, is that splenic regions, kidney, liver, stomach, intestines, this kind of dark browny red shrinks. And then the orange, which I apologize, it's orange, I'm sorry, goes up. That's muscle, skeletal muscle, right? As we said, during exercise, as intensity increases, more blood goes to the muscles and it's leaving going to those central splenic regions. You'll note brain, heart are both going to keep some. We're going to dial the brain down. The absolute amount stays basically the same as we go. Okay. The one on the right shows the exact same thing, but it's showing it as we also showed this increase in cardiac output. So rather than a relative percentage, the y-axis on the graph on the right is cardiac output. This is liters per minute. Okay. And so as the bars increase as we go from rest to walking to jogging, all out exercise, you will also note that the percentage of that bar that is being sort of going to skeletal muscle in the orange also increases. Okay. So you can see sort of at moderate and maximal exercise, right? We dramatically increase cardiac output and we're sending as much of it as we possibly can to skeletal muscle. We are really good and really efficient at providing blood flow to muscle. Okay. And that's one of the reasons that we're so good at being endurance exercise athletes. Also, we're really efficient at dissipating heat. Okay. Anybody, how many of you guys have a dog? Okay. Take your dog for a walk and it's hot. What does the dog do? It pants, right? Dogs don't sweat. Okay. Horses kind of sweat. You guys have been around a horse that's just been doing things. Horses sweat kind of a little bit. Okay. One of the things that we think we used to do back in our hunter-gathering days, we're really good endurance athletes because we're really good at dissipating heat because we don't have fur. We have a lot of body surface area per our size and muscle mass. We don't have a lot of hair, so we're good at dissipating heat. We would chase a deer for hours. It's hot out, just kind of jog behind the deer, do. Eventually, the deer runs too much, the deer overheats and falls over. Then we catch the deer and we kill it. And that's how we get food. Okay. They think as hunter-gatherers, that was one of the ways that we did things because we're so much better at dissipating heat than a lot of other mammals. Because we sweat and because we lack fur. And part of that is we can send lots of blood flow to muscles and get some, as you can see, to our skin to help us dissipate all of this heat. It's a very fascinating kind of thing. Okay. All right. So we'll start by showing the graph and then I'll talk about it just ever so slightly. Here's the blood pressure response to exercise. Okay. So the top two lines on the graph are systolic pressure. The bottom two are diastolic pressure. Okay. The red lines is during arm crank cycling, arm exercise, and the green is during traditional leg exercise. Okay. Couple of things I want you all to know and take away from this. As exercise intensity as the percentage of VO2 max or VO2 peak goes up, systolic pressure rises. Systolic pressure increases. Okay. Yet diastolic pressure stays the same. If diastolic pressure increases during exercise, you better call an ambulance. Okay. It is really a sign of cardiovascular disease. Okay. Interestingly, though, right, the red line in both instances is higher than the green line. So we get a larger increase or a higher blood pressure response during arm crank exercise compared to leg exercise. Okay. The reason that this happens is when you do arm exercise, you don't vasodilate your legs. So the change in peripheral resistance to flow is less. Okay. The blood pressure response to exercise is related to the amount of muscle mass engaged during exercise. The more muscle you use, you're going to get a more blunted increase in blood pressure because you're going to vasodilate to more places. So we drop peripheral resistance. So in this particular way, you can argue in people that are hypertensive, it's actually more dangerous from a blood pressure standpoint to do arm-only exercise than leg-only exercise. Think about that the next time you go to the PT clinic or the OT clinic and they've got folks doing arm cranking stuff. You got old folks, they're all hypertensive because all old people are hypertensive, basically, right? Like 80% of people over 70 are hypertensive. It's these wild numbers, and you get a more pronounced blood pressure response. And it's usually fine, but with increased pressure, the heart has to work harder. You have a greater chance if you have an aneurysm somewhere of rupturing the aneurysm, and so we've got to understand to be really careful about that. Okay. Okay. I want to mention really quickly this thing that happens to plasma volume. Then we'll talk about AVO2 difference in the Fick equation. Okay. So a strange thing happens to plasma volume while we exercise. Okay. You guys remember this? When we exercise, where does the water go from my blood? What do the bros all want? They want the pump, right? So when you exercise, you drive fluid, you drive water out of the blood into muscle, into other tissue. So if plasma leaves and the red cells stay, the relative percentage of your blood that is made up of red cells actually increases. Okay. We call this hemo concentration. As you begin to exercise, you force plasma to the skin, into the muscles, it leaves the blood, so red cells are a higher percentage of total blood volume. That hemo concentration, weirdly enough, actually makes it easier for us to carry oxygen in the blood. Okay. The same thing happens, you go to altitude, it doesn't go into muscle and things, it increases urine volume and you get hemo concentration there. Okay. And so it increases the O2 carrying capacity per unit of blood. All right, which is a fascinating kind of thing. You guys will see when we talk about aerobic training. Early on in aerobic training, you actually hemodilate rather than concentrate, or you hemodilute. You raise your plasma volume by retaining more water and drinking more water. You actually make your blood volume go up, but you dilute the amount of red cells that you have, which kind of counteracts each other. Okay, so this is a thing that happens. A thing that happens. All right, the last thing that I want to show you guys is something called arterial venous oxygen difference. Up till now, we have talked solely about the ability of the cardiovascular system to transport, to put oxygen onto red cells and get all of those red cells out to skeletal muscle. We're very good at this, very, very good. Okay, we vasodilate, we increase cardiac output, we increase stroke volume, we're very good at this. What AVO2 difference tells us is you've gotten this blood to skeletal muscle. How much and how good at it are we at taking oxygen off of the hemoglobin, off of our red cells in the capillaries, and diffusing it into skeletal muscle? Okay. Theoretically, you can get an AVO2 difference in any tissue, but for our purpose, what we really care about is skeletal muscle. So AVO2 difference is mathematically, there's 100 units of oxygen in arterial blood, there's 40 units of oxygen in venous blood. The difference between those is 60 units of oxygen. Where has that oxygen gone? It's gone into a tissue. Okay. So if we know how much oxygen makes it from the arterial side into the capillaries that are by a tissue, and we then know how much is left in venous blood that has come out of those capillaries, the difference tells us very simply how much has gone into a tissue, how much is diffused in. Okay, I don't care about you knowing any sort of absolute numbers or anything like that. Okay, AVO2 difference is about 6 milliliters of oxygen at rest. It can go up to kind of close to 20-ish during exercise. The absolute numbers don't matter. Okay, they don't matter. We'll come back and do FIC in a second. But what happens during exercise is it looks kind of like this. Okay, here in blue is oxygen in arterial blood. We're very good at our lungs. We're very good at getting oxygen in. It stays basically constant. And then the kind of pinky purple down here at the bottom is the corresponding amount of oxygen in venous blood. And so here's rest, right? So there's this much oxygen being taken out of the arteries of the capillaries that goes into muscle. As we exercise, venous content falls, which means the difference between the blue line and the purple line gets bigger. So we're extracting more oxygen and putting it into skeletal muscle. Okay. So we often will say that AVO2 difference is a measure of oxygen extraction by a tissue, okay, from red blood cells. How much is getting unloaded into that tissue? We can then take AVO2 difference and cardiac output and use an equation called the FIC equation, which I do want you guys to know. We can then use the FIC equation to predict oxygen consumption at any given exercise intensity or at rest. Okay, the FIC equation tells us that VO2 at any point in time, so energy use aerobically at any time, is equal to your cardiac output multiplied by the AVO2 difference. Okay. Which means that VO2 is equal to heart rate multiplied by stroke volume multiplied by a VO2 difference. So the person that can have the largest VO2 max is the person that can raise their heart rate the most. Okay. You all can raise your heart rate more than I can. Who can raise their stroke volume the most? Okay. Who has the biggest left ventricle? Who's got the strongest left ventricle from a contractility standpoint? Who's going to get the best preload and venous return? Multiplied by how much can you extract? How much of the oxygen in arterial blood can you take out and use in your tissue? AVO2 difference is primarily determined by capillaries and mitochondria. Okay? Capillaries and mitochondria. If you have more capillaries going to a tissue, more of your cardiac output can get to that tissue. And then the more mitochondria you have in a tissue, the lower you can keep the oxygen concentration in that tissue, which then provides a larger gradient to pull it off of the red blood cells in the capillaries. Okay? So we've got central circulatory capacity or cardiac output, and then we have sort of peripheral things like capillaries and mitochondria that help us extract things. Almost every response to aerobic training that raises VO2 max can be explained by examining what happens to these three variables. Okay. You get more blood volume by training. You get better preload, so it makes stroke volume go up. Okay. You get more red blood cells, right? So you've got a larger capacity there. That means you can carry more to the muscle. You train, you get more capillaries. So more of the flow that you have goes to muscle. You train, you get more mitochondria. You have more type 1 fibers. You have more mitochondria, so you're better able to extract and you can have a higher AVO2 difference. Right? You compete against somebody who is old like me. My max heart rate is lower. Therefore, I have a lower VO2 max. Everything else being equal compared to you guys. Okay? So the Fick equation is really, really, really useful. All right. This very, very last slide. I apologize if this is so small, but it was the only graph that I could find where it shows every variable that we've talked about graphed on the same scale across the same increase in exercise intensity together. Okay, so you can see the response of heart rate, stroke volume, cardiac output, blood pressure against oxygen consumption, which is here. Okay, you can also see the change in peripheral resistance. And then you can also see AVO2 difference down here. So these are all graphed across sort of the same scale as a person rides a bike at a higher intensity. Okay. So what happens to things during exercise? They all go up. Peripheral resistance goes down, but everything else goes up. Okay. They're mostly linear except for stroke volume, which is linear, and then it plateaus. Okay. Can somebody check? I can't remember if I gave you guys a quiz or not. I did. Is it open? Okay. Take the quiz and then make sure that you turn in the take-home assignment on the cardiovascular system. And then we have a test on Wednesday, the 18th. Okay. Several of you did not notice that the hormone quiz closed at noon on Friday. And so there have been several asks about, can I make it up? Can I get a chance to take it? We will look at the end of the semester about dropping a quiz. So right now I'm not particularly inclined to let folks sort of make things up. Okay. Make sure you take the quiz. Make sure you get your assignment turned in, and we'll go from there. Okay.